There are moments in history when desperation becomes so heavy that it bends the very soul of a person, twisting what was once pure into something unrecognizable. In the winter of 1912, in a cramped tenement on Chapel Street in New Haven, Connecticut, a widow named Margaret Holloway discovered just how far a human being could fall when hunger, debt, and hopelessness closed in from all sides. This is not a story of ghosts or supernatural forces. This is a story about something far more terrifying, the slow, methodical destruction of a woman's humanity, one stitch at a time, as she fed garments through a sewing machine that would consume everything she had left to give. Margaret Holloway was 34 years old when her husband Thomas died in October of 1911, crushed beneath a wagon carrying copper parts for the Winchester Repeating Arms Company factory. The accident happened on a Tuesday afternoon, and by Wednesday morning, Margaret understood with brutal clarity that she was alone in a world that had no place for women without men. Thomas had left her nothing but debts: rent owed to their landlord, money borrowed from neighbors, bills from the grocer, who had extended credit during Thomas's final months when work had been scarce. The funeral cost more than Margaret had seen in cash in her entire life, and she buried her husband knowing that she was burying any hope of a dignified future alongside him. New Haven in 1912 was a city of contrasts, where Yale University's Gothic towers looked down upon factory smokestacks that blackened the winter sky. The city had built its wealth on manufacturing, clocks, carriages, corsets, and firearms, and the wealthy lived in magnificent homes along Whitney Avenue, while thousands of immigrants and working poor crowded into tenements in the Fairhaven and Hill neighborhoods. Margaret had lived in New Haven her entire life, watching the city grow and change, watching factories rise and fall, watching women like herself disappear into the machinery of industrial progress without leaving so much as a whisper behind. She found work within a week of Thomas's death, though calling it work seemed too generous a term for what it actually was. Margaret became a piecework seamstress, taking in bundles of pre-cut fabric from the garment contractors who supplied the corset factories and clothing manufacturers that dotted the city. The arrangement was simple and brutal in its efficiency. She would be given 50 shirtwaists or 30 pairs of trousers, already cut and bundled, which she would sew together in her tenement room. For each completed garment that passed inspection, she would receive between 3 and 7 cents. If the stitching was uneven, if a seam puckered, if the thread showed even the slightest imperfection, the garment would be rejected and she would receive nothing. The contractor who brought her the first bundle was a man named Samuel Brenner, a thin, nervous man with ink-stained fingers and eyes that never quite met hers when he spoke. He arrived at her door on a Monday morning, carrying a massive bundle wrapped in brown paper and twine, which he deposited on her kitchen table without ceremony. Inside were 50 women's shirtwaists, delicate things made of white cotton that would be sold in department stores for $2 each. Margaret would receive 4 cents for each one she completed. If she worked every waking hour, she could finish perhaps 8 in a day, 32 cents. She needed to earn at least $1.50 each day just to cover rent and food. Brenner had looked around her sparse apartment, the single room that served as kitchen, workshop, and bedroom, the narrow bed pushed against one wall, the cast-iron stove that heated the space inadequately, and his expression had been one of practiced indifference. He had seen 1,000 rooms like this, 1,000 women like Margaret, desperate and alone and willing to work themselves to death for pennies. Before leaving, he had told her about the sewing machine. The machine was a Singer, he explained, one of the newer models with a foot treadle and an electric motor attachment. It could stitch 3 times faster than the old manual machines, which meant 3 times more garments completed, 3 times more money earned. The cost was $75, but Brenner could arrange for her to make payments, $2 a week taken directly from her earnings. It would take her nearly a year to pay off, but without the machine she would never be able to produce enough garments to survive. He had said all of this in a flat, rehearsed tone, as if he were reading from a script he had memorized long ago. Margaret had hesitated. $75 might as well have been $75,000. But Brenner had simply shrugged and picked up his bundle of fabric, preparing to leave. There were a dozen other widows, other desperate women, who would take the work and the machine without question. Margaret had watched him move toward the door and felt something cold settle in her chest. She had stopped him before he reached the threshold and agreed to the terms. The sewing machine arrived 2 days later, delivered by 2 men who hauled it up 3 flights of narrow stairs and set it up near the window where the light was best. It was a beautiful piece of machinery, all black enamel and gold detailing, with the Singer name emblazoned across its body in ornate script. The motor hummed when she pressed the foot pedal, a low, almost soothing sound that filled the room. Margaret had stood there for a long moment, her hand resting on the cold metal surface, and felt something shift inside her. This machine was going to save her life. She was certain of it. The first week with the machine felt like a miracle. Margaret worked from dawn until well past midnight, her foot pressing the treadle in a steady rhythm that became as natural as breathing. The needle moved so fast it was almost invisible, piercing fabric with mechanical precision, creating perfect, even stitches that would have taken her 3 times as long by hand. She completed the first bundle of 50 shirtwaists in 4 days instead of the week it would have taken without the machine. When Brenner returned to collect the finished garments, he had examined each one with his critical eye, holding them up to the light, checking the seams, and to Margaret's relief, he had approved all but 3. She received payment for 47 garments, $1.88, minus the $2 for the machine payment. She ended the week with a net loss. But Margaret told herself it would get better. She would work faster, make fewer mistakes, complete more garments. The second bundle Brenner brought was larger, 75 shirtwaists this time, and Margaret attacked them with renewed determination. She worked until her vision blurred, until her back screamed in protest from hunching over the machine, until her fingers were raw from guiding fabric beneath the racing needle. She learned to work through the pain, to ignore the headaches that came from eye strain, to push through the exhaustion that made her hands shake. The machine never tired. The machine never slowed. The machine simply waited for her to feed it more fabric, more work, more of herself. By the end of the second week, Margaret had developed a routine that consumed every moment of her existence. She would wake before dawn, light the stove to take the chill from the room, and begin sewing before the sun had fully risen. She worked through breakfast, eating hard bread and cold tea without stopping, her foot never leaving the treadle. At midday, she would pause only long enough to use the shared privy in the hallway and splash cold water on her face from the basin in her room. Then back to the machine, back to the endless rhythm of fabric and thread, back to the sound that had become the soundtrack of her life, the steady mechanical whir punctuated by the sharp tack-tack-tack of the needle striking fabric. The tenement building where Margaret lived was home to dozens of families, most of them immigrants, Irish, Italian, Polish, Jewish, all of them struggling to survive in a city that had promised prosperity but delivered only exhaustion. The building was always filled with noise, children crying, couples arguing, the sounds of life being lived in close quarters, but Margaret barely noticed anymore. She existed in a bubble of sound created by her sewing machine, a cocoon of mechanical rhythm that drowned out everything else. Her neighbors began to complain about the noise, the constant whir and clatter that went on from dawn until late into the night, but Margaret ignored them. She had no choice. The machine was her lifeline, and stopping meant starving. 3 weeks into her new life as a garment worker, Margaret realized she was losing weight. Her dresses hung looser on her frame, and when she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above her wash basin, she saw a woman she barely recognized. Her face had become gaunt, her cheekbones sharp beneath pale skin, her eyes ringed with dark circles that spoke of too many sleepless nights. But more disturbing than the physical changes was what she saw in her own eyes, a kind of emptiness, a dimming of something essential that she couldn't quite name. She looked away quickly and returned to the machine. The third payment to Brenner came due, and once again Margaret found herself handing over $2 from her meager earnings. She had worked herself nearly to collapse to complete 2 full bundles in a single week, 125 garments total, and after paying for the machine and buying the bare minimum of food, she had barely enough left to cover her rent. The landlord, a heavy-set man named Kowalski who collected rent every Friday evening, had started looking at her with suspicion, as if he could sense that she was teetering on the edge of financial ruin. He had seen it before, had seen tenants fall behind on rent and spiral into debt that they could never escape. Margaret could feel his doubt like a weight pressing down on her, adding to all the other weights she carried. It was around this time that Margaret began to notice something strange about the sewing machine. At first, she dismissed it as exhaustion playing tricks on her mind, but the feeling persisted and grew stronger with each passing day. The machine seemed to anticipate her movements, the treadle responding to her foot before she had fully pressed down, the needle beginning its descent a fraction of a second before her hands guided the fabric into position. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Margaret was spending so many hours with the machine that she noticed every detail of its behavior. She told herself it was simply that she had become so practiced, so attuned to the rhythm of the work, that her movements and the machine's operations had synchronized perfectly. But late at night, in the moments before exhaustion finally pulled her into sleep, she wondered if perhaps the machine was learning from her, adapting to her patterns, becoming something more than just a collection of metal and gears. The weather turned colder as November gave way to December, and Margaret's room became increasingly difficult to heat. Coal was expensive, and she rationed it carefully, burning only enough to keep the temperature barely above freezing. She worked in her coat and gloves, though she had to remove the gloves when sewing because they made her fingers too clumsy to guide the fabric properly. Her hands became red and chapped, the skin splitting at the knuckles, leaving small spots of blood on the white fabric she sewed. She learned to be more careful, to bandage her fingers before starting work each day, because Brenner would reject any garment that showed even the smallest bloodstain. Christmas approached, and New Haven transformed itself into a vision of holiday cheer that felt obscene in its disconnect from Margaret's reality. Shop windows along Chapel Street displayed elaborate decorations, wealthy families commissioned new dresses and suits for holiday parties, and the air filled with the scent of roasted chestnuts and pine. Margaret saw none of it, except during her brief trips to collect new bundles from Brenner's warehouse or to purchase the cheapest food she could find. The rest of her time was spent in her room, in the company of the machine, feeding it fabric and listening to its steady, hungry rhythm. The machine broke down for the first time on a Tuesday in mid-December, seizing up in the middle of a seam with a grinding sound that sent a spike of pure panic through Margaret's chest. She had been working on a bundle of men's work shirts, heavy cotton garments that required stronger thread and more forceful stitching, and the needle had simply stopped mid-stroke, frozen in place with the fabric bunched beneath it. Margaret had stared at the machine in horror, her mind immediately calculating the disaster this represented. Without the machine, she couldn't work. Without work, she couldn't earn money. Without money, she would lose her room and end up on the street. She had tried everything she could think of, checking the thread, examining the needle, cleaning out the bobbin housing, but nothing worked. The machine remained stubbornly frozen, and Margaret felt tears of frustration and fear burning in her eyes. She had finally broken down and asked one of her neighbors, an Italian man named Giuseppe, who worked as a mechanic at the carriage factory, if he could look at it. Giuseppe had agreed, climbing the stairs to her room and spending an hour taking apart the machine's internal mechanisms, while Margaret watched anxiously from her bed. The problem, Giuseppe explained in his heavily accented English, was that she had been running the machine too hard without proper maintenance. The gears needed oil, the tension needed adjustment, and several components were showing signs of excessive wear. He could fix it, but she needed to be more careful, needed to take breaks, needed to treat the machine with more respect. Margaret had nodded and thanked him, and when he asked for 50 cents for his trouble, she had paid him from her dwindling reserves without complaint. After he left, she had sat at the machine and placed her hands on its surface, and for reasons she couldn't fully explain, she had whispered an apology to it. The machine had started working again immediately after Giuseppe's repairs, and Margaret had thrown herself back into work with renewed intensity. She couldn't afford another breakdown, couldn't afford to lose even a single day of productivity. She began talking to the machine as she worked, a habit that started unconsciously and gradually became routine. She would tell it about her day, about the pain in her back and the exhaustion that never seemed to fade, about her fears and her memories of Thomas. The machine never responded, of course, but Margaret found comfort in the one-sided conversation, in having something to talk to in the loneliness of her room. Christmas came and went without acknowledgement. Margaret worked through the holiday, completing garments, while the building around her filled with the sounds of celebration, children laughing, families singing, the smell of special meals being prepared in the shared kitchen on the first floor. She ate cold bread and drank water from the tap in the hallway, and she sewed. The machine hummed its approval. By early January, Margaret had made 12 payments on the machine, reducing her debt to $51. At this rate, she would own it free and clear by October. But she was barely surviving. Her diet had been reduced to bread, potatoes, and occasional cheap cuts of meat when she could afford them. She had lost more weight, her body consuming itself to fuel the endless hours of work. Her hands had developed a permanent tremor from the vibration of the machine, and her hearing had begun to suffer from the constant noise. But she kept working because stopping was unthinkable. The machine had become the center of her universe, the axis around which everything else revolved. It was in January that Margaret began to notice the second strange thing about the machine. She had been working late one night, well past midnight, when exhaustion finally overcame her and she fell asleep at her work, her head dropping onto the fabric she had been sewing. She couldn't have been unconscious for more than a few minutes. But when she jerked awake with a gasp, she found that the seam she had been working on was complete. Not just complete, but perfect. The stitches were even and precise, exactly matching the quality of her best work. The fabric had been guided through the machine, and the work had been finished while she slept. Margaret had stared at the completed garment in confusion, her sleep-fogged mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. Had she finished it in a fugue state, working on autopilot while half unconscious? It seemed impossible, but what other explanation could there be? She had picked up the garment and examined it carefully, looking for some sign that would explain what had happened, but found nothing unusual except for the excellence of the work itself. She had set it aside and tried to push the incident from her mind, but it nagged at her for days afterward. The incident repeated itself a week later, and then again a few days after that. Each time Margaret would feel exhaustion pulling her down into sleep, would lose consciousness for just a few moments, and would wake to find more work completed. The garments were always perfect, always exactly what Brenner required, and gradually Margaret stopped questioning it. She was too tired to care about the mystery, too desperate to worry about the impossibility. If the machine somehow wanted to help her, to make her work easier, then she would accept that gift without looking too closely at its source. February brought a brutal cold snap that left ice on the inside of Margaret's windows and turned her room into a refrigerator. She burned through her coal supply in 2 weeks, and when she ran out, she had no money to buy more. She worked in temperatures so cold that her breath came out in clouds, wore every piece of clothing she owned in layers, and wrapped blankets around her shoulders while she sewed. Her fingers became so stiff from the cold that she could barely guide the fabric, but still she worked because the alternative was unthinkable. The machine seemed unaffected by the temperature, its motor humming with the same steady reliability, regardless of the freezing air around it. It was during one of those frozen February nights that Margaret finally understood what was happening to her. She had been working for 18 hours straight, her body screaming for rest, her mind foggy with exhaustion when she had looked down at her hands, guiding fabric beneath the needle, and realized she couldn't feel them anymore. Not just numb from cold, but truly absent, as if her hands belonged to someone else, as if they were simply tools being operated by some external force. She had tried to stop, to pull her hands away from the machine, but they had continued working without her conscious control, feeding fabric and adjusting seams with mechanical precision. The realization had hit her like a physical blow. She was disappearing. The woman she had been was being consumed by the work, by the machine, by the desperate need to survive. Every hour spent at the sewing machine took something from her, some essential part of her humanity, and fed it into the garments she created. She was being transformed, slowly and inexorably, from a person into an extension of the machine itself. And the most terrifying part was that she couldn't stop. She needed the machine to survive, and the machine needed her to operate, and together they had created a relationship that was devouring her from the inside out. The transformation accelerated through the late winter months of 1912, though Margaret was only dimly aware of the changes overtaking her. She had stopped looking in mirrors altogether, unable to bear the sight of what she was becoming. Her neighbors avoided her now, crossing to the other side of the hallway when they saw her coming, pulling their children close as if she carried some contagious disease. And perhaps she did. The disease of desperation, of utter depletion, of a life reduced to nothing but work and survival. The machine's constant noise had become such a fixture in the building that people had stopped complaining about it, accepting it as an inevitable part of their environment, like the smell of cooking cabbage or the sound of trains passing in the distance. Brenner continued to bring bundles of fabric every few days, and Margaret continued to transform them into finished garments with increasing speed and precision. She was completing nearly 200 pieces per week now, working at a pace that should have been physically impossible for a single person. Her production had increased so dramatically that Brenner had started bringing larger bundles, testing the limits of what she could accomplish. He never asked questions about how she managed to produce so much, never commented on her deteriorating appearance, never acknowledged the obvious toll the work was taking on her body and mind. He simply collected the finished garments, left new bundles, and deducted the weekly machine payment from her earnings. By March, Margaret had stopped sleeping in any conventional sense. She would collapse from exhaustion for an hour or two, sprawled across her bed with her clothes still on, and then drag herself back to the machine to continue working. During these brief periods of unconsciousness, the machine continued to operate. She would wake to find more garments completed, more work done, as if her body had continued laboring while her mind rested. She had long since stopped questioning this phenomenon, accepting it as simply another aspect of her new reality. The boundary between waking and sleeping, between conscious work and unconscious production, had dissolved entirely. Her financial situation had not improved despite her increased output. The $2 weekly payment for the machine, combined with rent and the minimum food needed to keep her body functioning, consumed nearly every cent she earned. She existed in a state of perpetual poverty, always one missed payment away from complete disaster, always hungry, always cold, always exhausted beyond measure. The debt she owed on the machine had been reduced to $37, but that milestone brought no sense of accomplishment, only the grim knowledge that she still had months more of this existence ahead of her. The physical changes had become impossible to ignore. Margaret's weight had dropped to less than 90 pounds, her body consuming its own muscle tissue to fuel the endless work. Her hands had developed permanent calluses and deformities from the constant pressure of guiding fabric, the fingers curling into claw-like shapes even when she wasn't sewing. Her spine had curved from countless hours hunched over the machine, giving her a stooped posture that made her look decades older than her 34 years. But worst of all were her eyes. They had developed a glazed, distant quality, as if she was looking at the world from somewhere far away, disconnected from the present moment. In early April, one of Margaret's neighbors, a Polish woman named Anna, who lived in the room below hers, knocked on her door late one evening. Margaret had answered to find Anna holding a bowl of soup and wearing an expression of genuine concern. Anna had tried to speak to her, had tried to convince her to take a break, to rest, to see a doctor, but Margaret had barely heard the words. The machine was calling her back to work, its silent summons more compelling than anything this well-meaning woman could say. Margaret had accepted the soup with a mumbled thanks and closed the door, setting the bowl aside untouched before returning to the machine. The soup had sat there for days, eventually growing a film of mold before Margaret finally threw it out. The machine had begun to change as well, though whether these changes were real or simply products of Margaret's deteriorating mental state was impossible to determine. The black enamel surface seemed to have developed a subtle iridescence, like oil on water, that shifted and moved in the lamplight. The gold detailing appeared brighter, almost luminous in the darkroom, and the sound, the steady mechanical hum that had once seemed so ordinary, now carried overtones that Margaret couldn't quite identify, notes that sounded almost like whispers, almost like voices speaking words just below the threshold of comprehension. She had started to believe that the machine was alive in some way, that it possessed a consciousness or will of its own. This belief should have terrified her, but instead it brought a strange sense of comfort. If the machine was alive, then she wasn't alone in her suffering. They were partners in this endless cycle of production, two beings merged into a single purpose. The machine needed her to operate its mechanisms, to feed it fabric and guide its needle, and she needed the machine to transform her labor into money that barely kept her alive. They were locked together in a symbiotic relationship that was destroying them both. It was in late April that Margaret received a visitor she hadn't expected. A representative from the Connecticut Factory Inspection Office, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Harriet Blackwell, who had heard complaints about working conditions in the garment trade. Mrs. Blackwell had climbed the stairs to Margaret's room, carrying a leather portfolio, and wearing an expression of professional determination that wilted the moment she saw Margaret's living conditions. She had stood in the doorway, her eyes taking in the single cramped room, the piles of fabric, the sewing machine positioned near the window, and Margaret herself, gaunt, hollow-eyed, barely human. Mrs. Blackwell had asked questions that Margaret answered in monosyllables, her attention constantly pulled back to the machine, to the work waiting to be done. How many hours did she work each day? All of them. How much was she paid per garment? 3 to 7 cents. Did she receive breaks? No. Was she aware that these working conditions were unconscionable, that no human being should be subjected to such exploitation? Margaret had simply stared at the woman, unable to comprehend what she wanted. Mrs. Blackwell had tried to explain that there were organizations that could help, charitable groups and labor reformers who were fighting to improve conditions for garment workers, but Margaret had interrupted her. The machine was waiting. The work needed to be done. Mrs. Blackwell needed to leave so Margaret could return to sewing. The inspector had tried to protest, had tried to convince Margaret to accept help, but Margaret had simply opened the door and stood waiting for the woman to leave. Mrs. Blackwell had finally departed, but not before promising that she would return, that this situation was unacceptable and something would be done. Margaret had closed the door behind her and immediately returned to the machine, pressing the treadle and feeling the familiar vibration travel up through her leg, into her body, settling into the very core of her being. Whatever Mrs. Blackwell thought she could do to help, it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the machine and the work, and the desperate need to survive one more day. The debt on the machine had been reduced to $23 by the end of April. Margaret marked this milestone with no celebration, no sense of progress. She simply noted it mentally and continued working, her foot pressing the treadle in its endless rhythm, her hands guiding fabric with mechanical precision. Spring had arrived in New Haven, bringing warmer temperatures and longer days, but Margaret experienced none of it. Her world had contracted to the dimensions of her room, the surface of her work table, the space between her hands and the racing needle. Everything else had ceased to exist. May arrived with unseasonably warm weather that turned Margaret's room into a suffocating box. The temperature climbed into the 80s during the day, and without ventilation beyond the single window that she kept closed to muffle the machine's noise, the heat became almost unbearable. Margaret worked through it, her clothes soaked with sweat, her vision swimming in the shimmering air. The machine seemed impervious to the heat, its motor humming with the same relentless consistency, regardless of temperature. If anything, it seemed to run smoother in the warmth, the metal components expanding slightly to create even more precise movements. Margaret envied the machine its imperviousness to physical discomfort, its ability to continue functioning regardless of external conditions. The debt had been reduced to $15 by mid-May, and for the first time in months, Margaret allowed herself to imagine what would happen when the machine was finally paid off. Would her situation improve? Would she be able to keep more of her earnings, perhaps afford better food, warmer clothes for the coming winter? Or would she simply continue in this same pattern indefinitely, working herself to death for pennies, while Brenner brought endless bundles of fabric to be transformed into garments? The thought of continuing like this forever should have filled her with despair, but Margaret found she felt nothing at all. The capacity for emotional response had been worn away along with everything else, leaving only a hollow determination to survive one more day, and then another, and then another. It was during this period that Margaret began to lose track of time in a more fundamental way. Days blended together into an indistinguishable stream of work and brief periods of unconsciousness. She would look up from the machine to find that hours had passed in what felt like minutes, or conversely, that only moments had elapsed during what felt like an eternity of stitching. The normal markers of time, sunrise, sunset, mealtimes, the sounds of neighbors beginning and ending their days, ceased to have meaning. Margaret existed in a perpetual present tense, always sewing, always tired, always hungry, with no clear distinction between past and future. The building's other residents had begun to avoid her floor entirely when possible, taking the stairs quickly past her door and speaking in hushed voices about the strange widow in room 12 who never stopped working. Children were warned not to play near her door, and more than once Margaret heard parents using her as a cautionary tale. Work too hard, and you'll end up like the sewing woman, more machine than human. These whispered conversations filtered through her closed door and registered somewhere in Margaret's consciousness, but she couldn't muster the energy to care what they thought of her. Their opinions, their fears, their pity, none of it mattered compared to the imperative to keep working. Brenner had begun bringing different types of garments now, testing the limits of what Margaret could produce. He brought delicate blouses that required intricate detail work, heavy canvas work jackets that strained the machine's capabilities, children's clothing so small that precision was paramount. Margaret completed them all with the same mechanical efficiency, her hands moving with a speed and accuracy that seemed to transcend human limitation. Brenner never commented on the quality of her work or the impossible volume of her output. He simply collected the finished garments, left new bundles, and deducted his payment. The transaction had become purely mechanical, two components of a larger system fulfilling their designated functions. In late May, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Blackwell had returned, as she had promised, but this time she brought company. A reporter from the New Haven Register, a young man named Daniel Morrison, had accompanied the factory inspector to document the conditions of garment workers in the city. Morrison had entered Margaret's room with his notebook ready, and his expression set in the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to witnessing hardship. But even his professional detachment cracked when he saw Margaret's living conditions and the state she had deteriorated into. Mrs. Blackwell had tried to interview Margaret again, asking the same questions she had posed during her previous visit, but Margaret's responses were even less coherent than before. Words came slowly, her thoughts fragmenting before she could complete sentences. Morrison had begun taking notes, his pencil scratching across the page, and the sound had irritated Margaret in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Everything irritated her now. Sounds, lights, the presence of other people, anything that distracted from the work. She had asked them to leave, her voice flat and empty, and when they hesitated, she had simply turned back to the machine and resumed sewing, ignoring their presence entirely. Morrison had tried to engage her, asking about her background, her late husband, how she had ended up in this situation, but Margaret had stopped responding. The machine's rhythm had swallowed her attention completely, and the two visitors might as well have been ghosts for all the acknowledgement she gave them. Eventually, Mrs. Blackwell had led Morrison out, but not before the reporter had taken several photographs of the room with a camera he pulled from a leather bag. The flash powder had exploded with a brightness that made Margaret flinch, spots dancing in her vision for minutes afterward. But she hadn't stopped working. Nothing could make her stop working now. The article appeared in the Register 3 days later, though Margaret never saw it. Morrison had written a scathing exposé on the conditions of piecework garment seamstresses in New Haven, using Margaret's situation as the centerpiece of his investigation. He had described her room, her physical deterioration, the inhuman pace of her work, and the exploitative system that kept women like her trapped in poverty, despite working themselves to the point of complete physical collapse. The article included one of the photographs Morrison had taken, a grainy image of Margaret hunched over her sewing machine, her face gaunt and shadowed, her hands blurred with motion. The caption read, "The Human Cost of Fashion, a New Haven widow's descent into industrial slavery." The article created a minor sensation among New Haven's reform-minded citizens and labor activists. Several charitable organizations reached out to Mrs. Blackwell, offering to help Margaret, to provide her with food, medical care, even alternative employment that wouldn't destroy her health. A collection was taken up at one of the churches on the Green to help pay off her debt on the sewing machine. Letters were written to the mayor demanding action on behalf of the city's exploited garment workers. For approximately 2 weeks, Margaret Holloway became a symbol of everything wrong with the industrial piecework system, a martyr to unchecked capitalism and the exploitation of desperate women. But none of this attention reached Margaret herself. She was insulated from it all by the walls of her room and the all-consuming focus on her work. Brenner continued to bring bundles, she continued to sew them, and the machine continued its endless humming rhythm. The debt had dropped to $9 by the first week of June. Margaret noted this milestone with the same empty acknowledgement she gave everything else, and then she returned to work. The machine was warm beneath her hands, almost hot to the touch despite the lack of direct sunlight in the room. It pulsed with a kind of energy that seemed to flow up through her fingers, into her arms, spreading throughout her body. Or perhaps the energy was flowing the other way, from her body into the machine, feeding it, sustaining it, keeping it alive and functioning. Margaret had stopped eating regularly by this point. Food had become an inconvenience, a waste of time that took her away from the machine. She would occasionally force down a piece of bread or drink some water when her body's needs became impossible to ignore, but these moments grew further apart. Her body had learned to run on almost nothing, cannibalizing its own tissues to fuel the endless work. She was disappearing physically, her flesh melting away until she was little more than bones and sinew held together by sheer will and the machine's inexorable pull. Her weight had dropped below 80 pounds, her clothes hanging on her skeletal frame like fabric draped over a wire form. The machine's debt reached $5 in mid-June, and Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she would not survive to see it paid off. This knowledge came to her not as a shock or a source of fear, but as a simple fact, as undeniable as the sunrise or the changing seasons. She was dying, had been dying for months, and the process was nearly complete. The woman she had been, Margaret Holloway, widow of Thomas Holloway, resident of New Haven, human being with thoughts and feelings and a right to exist, had been consumed entirely. What remained was something else, something that existed purely to serve the machine, to feed it fabric and transform that fabric into finished garments. She had become exactly what the system demanded, a perfectly efficient production unit stripped of all humanity, all individual identity, all claim to dignity or worth beyond her capacity to work. The final payment came due in the last week of June, on a Friday evening that brought with it oppressive humidity and the threat of thunderstorms. Brenner arrived with his usual bundle of fabric and collected the week's finished garments, examining them with his practiced eye. Margaret had produced 237 pieces that week, a number that should have been impossible for a single seamstress working alone. Brenner counted out her earnings, $9.49, and then deducted the final $2 for the machine payment. He handed her the remaining $7.49, and for the first time in 9 months, he spoke to her about something other than work. The machine was hers now, he said. Paid in full. She owned it free and clear. He pulled a receipt from his pocket and handed it to her, a small piece of paper that documented the completion of her debt. Margaret had taken the receipt with hands that trembled from something other than the constant vibration of sewing, and she had stared at it without comprehension. The machine was hers. After 9 months of payments, after countless hours of work, after sacrificing her health and her humanity, the machine finally belonged to her completely. Brenner had left her with a new bundle, 300 pieces this time, more than he had ever brought before, and departed without waiting for a response. Margaret had stood there holding the receipt, feeling nothing at all, and then she had set it aside and returned to work. But something had changed. Margaret could feel it in the air, in the machine, in the very fabric of reality around her. The completion of the debt had altered the relationship between woman and machine in some fundamental way. Before, there had been an external force, the debt, the payments, the legal obligation, that had bound her to the machine. Now that external force was gone, and what remained was something deeper, something that had grown during those 9 months of constant interaction. The machine didn't just belong to her legally, she belonged to it in a way that transcended ownership or debt. They had merged, the boundaries between flesh and metal dissolving, until it was impossible to say where one ended and the other began. The thunderstorm broke just after midnight, rain lashing against the window with such force that water began to seep through cracks in the frame. Lightning illuminated the room in stark flashes that turned everything into high-contrast shadows. Thunder shook the building, causing the thin walls to vibrate and the floor to tremble beneath Margaret's feet. But through it all, the machine continued its steady rhythm, unaffected by the storm's fury. Margaret worked through the night, her hands guiding fabric, while lightning turned the world outside into a chaos of light and sound. She felt strangely calm, as if the storm were happening in another world entirely, one that no longer had any connection to her existence. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and smelling of ozone and wet earth. Margaret had completed 50 garments during the night, her production never slowing despite the distraction of the weather. She paused only when the early morning light began to filter through her water-streaked window, turning to look at the machine with something approaching recognition. It sat there in the growing light, black enamel gleaming, gold detailing catching the sun's rays, and Margaret understood with perfect clarity what it had done to her. The machine had saved her life by destroying it, had given her the means to survive by consuming everything that made survival meaningful. It had taken her desperation and transformed it into a different kind of tragedy, not the quick end of starvation or homelessness, but a slow dissolution of selfhood that left her alive in only the most technical sense. She should have felt anger or resentment or grief, but those emotions required an intact self to experience them, and Margaret no longer possessed such a thing. She felt only a distant acknowledgement, the way one might note a mathematical fact or observe a natural phenomenon. The machine had won, if winning was the right word for what had transpired. It had claimed her completely, and she had let it happen because the alternative was death, or perhaps death would have been preferable, and she had made the wrong choice 9 months ago when she agreed to Brenner's terms. But it was too late for such considerations now. The path had been chosen, and Margaret had followed it to its inevitable conclusion. The charitable organizations that had been mobilized by Morrison's article finally located Margaret's address in early July and sent representatives to offer assistance. 2 women from the New Haven Women's Christian Association arrived at her door carrying baskets of food and wearing expressions of determined benevolence. They had knocked persistently until Margaret answered, and then they had tried to push their way into her room with offers of help and salvation. But Margaret had blocked the doorway with her emaciated body and refused to let them enter. They had insisted, speaking in the loud, slow voices people use when addressing those they consider mentally deficient, explaining that they wanted to help her, that she didn't have to live like this, that there were alternatives to this suffering. Margaret had listened to their words without processing their meaning, waiting for them to finish so she could close the door and return to work. When they finally paused for breath, she had spoken for the first time in days, her voice rough from disuse. She didn't need their help, she told them. She didn't want their charity. She had everything she needed. The machine provided for her. The work sustained her. They should leave and not return. The women had exchanged glances laden with pity and concern, and one of them had tried to argue, to convince Margaret that she was ill and needed medical attention. But Margaret had simply closed the door in their faces and turned the lock. Their voices had continued on the other side of the door for several minutes, pleading and cajoling. But eventually they had given up and departed, their footsteps receding down the stairs. The incident had cost Margaret nearly 20 minutes away from the machine, and she resented the interruption with an intensity that surprised her. Every moment away from work felt like a betrayal, a violation of the unspoken contract she had entered into. She settled back at the machine and pressed the treadle, feeling the familiar vibration travel through her body, and the resentment faded into the background noise of her thoughts. The rhythm resumed, the needle moved, the fabric fed through, and Margaret's hands performed their function with mechanical precision. This was right. This was how things were meant to be. Everything else was an intrusion, a distraction from the only thing that mattered. July brought heat that turned New Haven into a furnace. Temperatures climbed into the 90s and stayed there for days at a time. With humidity so thick the air felt solid. Margaret's room became virtually uninhabitable for normal human occupation, the heat and poor ventilation creating conditions that would have driven most people to seek relief elsewhere. But Margaret remained at her post. working through the suffocating temperatures, while her body shed what little moisture it retained through constant sweating. She had stopped perspiring normally weeks ago, her body too dehydrated to produce sweat in any significant quantity, and instead her skin took on a dry, papery quality that cracked and bled at the slightest pressure. The machine showed no signs of being affected by the heat. If anything, it seemed to thrive in the elevated temperatures, running smoother and faster than ever before. Margaret matched its pace, her production reaching levels that defied rational explanation. She was completing over 300 garments per week now, working 20 hours a day or more, her brief periods of unconsciousness growing shorter and less frequent. Sleep had become almost entirely unnecessary, her body running on reserves that should have been depleted months ago. She existed in a state beyond exhaustion, beyond pain, beyond any normal human limitation. The machine sustained her, feeding her some kind of energy that replaced food and water and rest. Brenner had noticed the increase in her production and had begun bringing larger and larger bundles. His visits had taken on a ritualistic quality. He would arrive at the same time each week, collect the finished garments without comment, leave a new bundle and depart. He no longer counted out her earnings or engaged in even minimal conversation. The money was simply left on the table, and Margaret would add it to the small pile of bills that had begun to accumulate in her room. She had more money now than at any point since Thomas's death, but it meant nothing to her. Money was just paper, useful only insofar as it allowed her to pay rent and occasionally purchase the minimal food her body required. Beyond that, it had no value, no significance, no power to change her circumstances or restore what had been lost. In mid-July, Margaret's landlord Kowalski made one of his rare visits to her room, ostensibly to collect rent, but really to check on the tenant who had become the subject of considerable gossip and concern. He had knocked on her door and waited, and when Margaret finally answered, he had recoiled visibly at her appearance. She was barely recognizable as human anymore, skeletal to the point of seeming corpse-like. Her skin stretched tight over bones, her eyes sunken deep in their sockets and burning with a feverish intensity that had nothing to do with illness and everything to do with the consuming focus of her work. Kowalski had stammered something about the rent, and Margaret had handed him the money without speaking, then closed the door before he could say anything else. The landlord had stood in the hallway for a long moment, staring at the closed door, and then he had descended to the building's first floor, where he sought out several of the other tenants. Something needed to be done, he told them. The woman in room 12 was clearly dying, clearly in need of intervention, and as landlord he felt some responsibility for what was happening under his roof. But what could be done? The other tenants had shrugged and looked away, unwilling to get involved. She paid her rent on time, caused no real trouble beyond the noise of her sewing machine, and if she wanted to work herself to death, that was her choice to make. This was America in 1912, where individual liberty meant the freedom to destroy yourself through labor, if that was what you chose. August arrived with a heat wave that killed 3 elderly residents in Margaret's building and sent dozens of New Haven citizens to the hospital with heat-related ailments. The temperature reached 104 degrees on the first Tuesday of the month, and the city's health department issued warnings about staying indoors and drinking plenty of water. Margaret did neither, continuing her work through the deadly heat while her body temperature climbed to levels that should have resulted in organ failure and death. But she didn't die. She continued functioning, continued sewing, continued feeding garments through the machine in an endless stream of production that had taken on a supernatural quality. The machine had changed in ways that were now undeniable even to Margaret's diminished consciousness. The black enamel surface had developed what looked like veins or cracks, patterns that glowed faintly in the darkness of night. The gold detailing pulsed with a light that had no obvious source, and the sound it made had evolved into something that contained harmonics and overtones that resembled human speech. Margaret could almost make out words in the mechanical humming, almost understand what the machine was trying to tell her. She leaned closer during her work, pressing her ear near the motor housing, listening to the whispers that seemed to emerge from the metal itself. The other tenants had stopped using the stairway that passed Margaret's door, instead taking a more circuitous route through the building to avoid her floor entirely. Rumors had spread throughout the tenement and into the surrounding neighborhood that room 12 was haunted, that the widow who lived there had made some kind of bargain with dark forces, that the sound of her sewing machine contained curses that could bring misfortune to anyone who heard them. Children dared each other to approach her door and listen, and those brave or foolish enough to accept the challenge reported hearing things that gave them nightmares. Voices speaking in languages that hurt to hear, rhythms that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate directly in the bones, a presence that felt hungry and ancient and utterly inhuman. These reports were dismissed by most adults as childish imagination and superstition, but they contributed to an atmosphere of unease that had settled over the building. Several families gave notice and moved out, citing various reasons, but all of them leaving with visible relief. Kowalski found himself unable to rent the vacant apartments, as prospective tenants would arrive, hear the sound of Margaret's machine echoing through the building, and decline to sign leases. The building was developing a reputation as cursed or unlucky, and property values in the surrounding area had begun to decline. Kowalski considered evicting Margaret, but he was afraid of her in a way he couldn't quite articulate, afraid of what might happen if he confronted her directly. Margaret was aware of none of this. Her world had contracted to the space within arm's reach of the sewing machine, and everything beyond that perimeter existed only as vague shadows and distant sounds. She worked with a focus that transcended human capability, her movements so perfectly synchronized with the machine that they appeared to be a single organism rather than woman and tool. The fabric fed through without her conscious guidance, the needle struck with precision she didn't direct. The finished garments accumulated in neat piles that she didn't remember creating. She had become automated, a biological component in a mechanical process, and the distinction between Margaret and machine had ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Brenner's visits had taken on a surreal quality. He would arrive to find hundreds of garments completed to absolute perfection, far more than should have been possible for a single worker to produce. He had stopped bringing bundles personally, instead sending a young assistant who would leave the fabric outside Margaret's door and collect the finished work without entering the room or attempting to speak to her. The assistant, a nervous boy of perhaps 15, had reported to Brenner that there was something wrong with the widow's apartment, that the air around her door felt thick and resistant, that looking at the closed door too long made his head hurt and his vision swim. Brenner had dismissed these complaints as youthful dramatics, but he had nonetheless stopped visiting the room himself. The money Margaret earned continued to accumulate in her room, stacked on the small table beside her narrow bed. She had no use for it beyond the weekly rent payment, and even that transaction had become automated. She would leave the exact amount outside her door every Friday evening, and Kowalski would collect it without knocking or attempting interaction. The pile of bills grew larger each week, representing wealth that Margaret couldn't spend and didn't want. She had earned more in the past 3 months than in the entire previous year, but it meant nothing. Money was an abstraction, a symbol of value in a world she no longer inhabited. Her reality was measured in stitches per minute, in garments completed, in the endless rhythm of the machine. In the 3rd week of August, the machine spoke to her clearly for the first time, not in whispers or half-heard suggestions, but in actual words that Margaret understood with perfect clarity. The voice came not from the machine itself, but seemed to resonate inside her own head, as if the machine had gained direct access to her thoughts. It told her things, about the nature of work and value, about the exchange of life force for survival, about the true cost of existence in an industrial age. It explained that every garment she sewed contained a portion of her soul, woven into the fabric through her labor, and that these pieces of her were now scattered across New Haven and beyond, worn by strangers who would never know the price that had been paid for their clothing. Margaret listened to these revelations without surprise or horror, accepting them as simple statements of fact. Of course, her soul had been consumed by the work. What else did she have to offer in exchange for survival? Of course, each garment carried a piece of her with it into the world. How else could she explain the impossible volume of her production? The machine was telling her nothing she hadn't already known on some level, simply making explicit what had been implicit throughout the past 9 months. She had sold herself piece by piece, and the transaction was nearly complete. The machine told her other things as well, in its new voice that bypassed her ears and spoke directly to her consciousness. It told her about the other women who had worked themselves to death over sewing machines in tenements across the city, across the country, across the industrialized world. It showed her visions of their faces, dozens of them, hundreds, maybe thousands, women with the same hollow eyes and gaunt features that Margaret now possessed, women who had made the same bargain and paid the same price. They formed a sisterhood of the consumed, a congregation of the sacrificed, and Margaret was joining their ranks. Soon she would be one more ghost in the machinery of industrial production, one more forgotten casualty in the endless war between survival and dignity. These communications from the machine should have driven Margaret into panic or despair, but instead they brought a strange sense of peace. She wasn't alone in her suffering, wasn't unique in her sacrifice. She was part of a larger pattern, a cog in a vast machine that was far bigger than the Singer sewing device in her room. The entire industrial system was a machine, and all workers were components within it, feeding it their labor and their lives in exchange for the bare minimum needed to continue functioning. Margaret had simply made this truth more literal than most, had compressed the slow exploitation that killed workers over decades into a concentrated 9-month transformation that left the process undeniable. The heat wave broke in late August, bringing cooler temperatures and afternoon thunderstorms that offered relief to New Haven's surviving citizens. Margaret barely noticed the change, continuing her work with the same mechanical intensity, regardless of external conditions. She had stopped sleeping entirely by this point, her body no longer requiring rest in any conventional sense. She existed in a state of perpetual activity, sewing continuously for days at a time without pause. The machine matched her pace perfectly, never overheating, never breaking down, running with supernatural reliability that defied all mechanical principles. It was during one of these endless work sessions, late on a Thursday night near the end of August, that Margaret looked down at her hands and realized she couldn't see them clearly anymore. Her vision had been failing for weeks, but this was different. Her hands were becoming transparent, as if they were fading from physical existence. She could see through them to the fabric beneath, could see the bones and veins and muscles rendered in ghostly outline against the white cotton she was sewing. The sight should have terrified her, but Margaret felt only a distant curiosity. She was disappearing, being consumed completely by the machine and the work, and soon there would be nothing left of her at all. The realization brought with it no fear or resistance, only acceptance. This was always how it was going to end. From the moment she agreed to take the sewing machine, from the moment she made that first payment to Brenner, this outcome had been inevitable. The machine had needed someone to operate it, and Margaret had needed a means of survival. And together they had entered into a bargain that could only conclude one way. She would work until there was nothing left of her to consume, and then the machine would wait for the next desperate woman to come along and begin the cycle again. This was the true nature of their relationship. Not owner and tool, not even master and servant, but predator and prey engaged in a dance that masqueraded as mutual benefit. September arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made New Haven beautiful, the leaves beginning to turn colors and the air carrying hints of wood smoke and approaching winter. Margaret saw none of it, existing now in a twilight state between life and death, between human and machine, between presence and absence. Her body had become almost entirely transparent, a ghost of flesh that could barely interact with physical reality. She could still operate the sewing machine. That ability remained intact, even as everything else faded. But her connection to the material world had grown tenuous and uncertain. The garments she produced now showed signs of her transformation. They were perfect in construction, flawless in every technical detail, but they carried with them something else, an atmosphere, a presence, a quality that made people uncomfortable without being able to explain why. The shopkeepers who eventually received these garments reported that they were difficult to sell, that customers would pick them up and then set them down quickly, as if the fabric itself was somehow wrong. Several stores returned their orders to the manufacturers, citing quality concerns that couldn't be specifically identified. The garments looked fine, wore well, showed no obvious defects, but something about them was deeply unsettling. Brenner's assistant stopped coming to collect finished work in mid-September, and the garments began to pile up in Margaret's room. Dozens of completed pieces, then hundreds, stacked in neat bundles that filled the available space and began to crowd out everything else. Margaret continued producing them regardless, unable to stop, even though there was nowhere for them to go. The machine demanded work, and she provided it. And the fact that the work now served no economic purpose was irrelevant. The system they had created, woman and machine locked in their deadly partnership, had transcended practical considerations and become something approaching ritual, a religious observance that continued for its own sake. The other residents of the building had begun to notice changes beyond just the accumulating garments. The temperature on the third floor, where Margaret's room was located, had dropped significantly below the rest of the building, staying cold even during warm days. The walls near her door had developed frost patterns despite the September weather, and the sound of the sewing machine had taken on new qualities. Grinding notes that set teeth on edge, harmonics that caused headaches, rhythms that seemed designed to unsettle rather than comfort. Several tenants reported dreams about the machine, visions of it running endlessly while the building crumbled around it, continuing to sew long after everyone had died or fled. Kowalski had finally gathered his courage and returned to Margaret's door in the final week of September, determined to confront her about the situation. He had knocked repeatedly without receiving an answer, and then, steeling himself, had used his master key to open the door. The sight that greeted him defied rational explanation and would haunt him for the rest of his life. The room was packed floor to ceiling with completed garments, thousands of them, leaving only a narrow path from the door to where the sewing machine sat near the window. And at the machine, barely visible as more than a shimmer in the air, was something that might have been Margaret Holloway, or might have been something else entirely, a presence without solid form, hands moving without flesh, a ghost operating a machine that glowed with an inner light that had nothing to do with electricity or oil lamps. Kowalski had stumbled backward out of the room, slamming the door and locking it behind him. He had run down the stairs and out into the street, where he stood gasping for air and trying to make sense of what he had witnessed. Other tenants had gathered, asking what was wrong, what he had seen, but Kowalski couldn't find words to describe it. He had simply shaken his head and walked away. And within 2 days, he had sold the building for a fraction of its value to a buyer who didn't ask questions. The new owner, a speculator from New York, would discover Margaret's rooms soon enough, but that was no longer Kowalski's problem. He had washed his hands of the entire situation and left New Haven for good, moving to a different city where the sound of sewing machines didn't invade his dreams. Inside room 12, Margaret continued her work, unaware of Kowalski's visit or his flight. She had passed beyond awareness of external events, existing now in a space defined entirely by the machine and the work it demanded. Her consciousness had fragmented into something that barely qualified as thought, just patterns and rhythms, stitches and seams, the endless flow of fabric through the machine. She was no longer Margaret Holloway, in any meaningful sense. That woman had died months ago, consumed by labor and desperation and the machine's insatiable hunger. What remained was something else, something that existed solely to serve the machine's purpose. The machine itself had completed its own transformation, becoming something far more than the sum of its mechanical parts. It pulsed with energy drawn from Margaret's consumed life force, glowing with light that had no natural source, operating with precision that transcended engineering. It had become a kind of engine that ran on human suffering, a device that converted desperation and exhaustion into finished garments, and it would continue operating as long as there was anything left to consume. The relationship between Margaret and the machine had reached its ultimate expression, complete and total merger, the final dissolution of boundaries, the achievement of perfect unity through the destruction of individual identity. On the last day of September, exactly 1 year after Margaret's husband Thomas had died beneath that copper-laden wagon, the sewing machine finally stopped. The sudden silence was so shocking, so absolute after months of constant noise, that it seemed to create a vacuum in the building. Neighbors who had grown accustomed to the endless mechanical rhythm found themselves disoriented by its absence, unable to sleep without the sound that had become part of their environment. They waited for it to resume, for the familiar humming to start again, but it didn't. The machine sat silent in room 12, its work finally complete. When the new owner of the building finally opened Margaret's room a week later, accompanied by police who had been called to investigate the complaints about smell and the abandoned rent, they found a scene that would result in official reports being carefully worded to avoid anything that might be dismissed as hysteria or delusion. The room was packed with garments, over 5,000 completed pieces by official count, all perfect in construction, and all carrying that same unsettling quality that made them difficult to look at for long. The sewing machine sat near the window, cold and dark, looking like nothing more than an ordinary Singer device with no power source connected. And of Margaret Holloway herself. There was no sign beyond a small pile of dust on the chair where she had sat, dust that might have been the remains of a human body that had been utterly consumed, or might have been simply the accumulated grime of a year's neglect. The garments were eventually sold in bulk to a dealer in used clothing who distributed them throughout New Haven and surrounding cities. People who wore them reported no specific problems. The clothes functioned perfectly well for their intended purpose, but many found themselves uncomfortable in ways they couldn't articulate, and most ended up donating or discarding the items after only brief use. The sewing machine was sold along with the rest of Margaret's possessions, bringing $3 at auction to cover the back rent and disposal costs. It went to another widow, another desperate woman struggling to survive in the industrial landscape of early 20th century America. And in her small apartment in Fairhaven, it began to hum again, waiting patiently for the cycle to repeat. The building where Margaret had lived continued to operate for another 30 years before being condemned and demolished, but it never shook its reputation as an unlucky place. Tenants came and went rapidly, none staying long, all reporting the same vague sense of unease that made the apartments feel wrong, despite having no specific defects. The room where Margaret had worked was never successfully rented again. It remained vacant through changes of ownership and attempted renovations, resistant to all efforts to make it habitable. People who entered it reported feeling watched, feeling cold, hearing sounds that couldn't be explained as normal building noise. Eventually, it was simply sealed off and forgotten, written out of the building's floor plans as if it had never existed. This is what remains of Margaret Holloway's story, a cautionary tale about the cost of survival in an age of industrial exploitation, a reminder that sometimes the price we pay to live is the very life we're trying to preserve. She had sold her soul not to any supernatural entity, but to something far more mundane and far more deadly. The economic system that valued her only for her capacity to work, that measured her worth in stitches per minute and garments per week, that consumed her humanity and discarded what remained without ceremony or recognition. The sewing machine had been merely the instrument through which this transaction occurred, the physical manifestation of forces much larger than itself. In the years that followed, labor reforms would slowly improve conditions for garment workers, though the changes came too late for women like Margaret. The tragedy of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911 had sparked a movement that would eventually lead to regulations on working hours, safety standards, and minimum wages. But these victories were built on a foundation of countless forgotten deaths, countless women who had disappeared into the machinery of industrial production without leaving names or stories behind. Margaret Holloway had become one of those vanished women, remembered by no one, mourned by no one, existing only as a brief mention in a newspaper article that yellowed and crumbled and was eventually lost to time. The sewing machine that had consumed her continued its journey through the hands of desperate women, each one drawn to its promise of survival, and each one paying the same ultimate price. It operated for decades, passing from owner to owner, always finding another soul to feed on, always patient in its hunger. Some say it's still out there somewhere, in some tenement or basement workshop, humming its deadly rhythm while another woman sacrifices herself one stitch at a time. Others say it was finally destroyed, thrown into a furnace or smashed to pieces, its cycle of predation finally broken. But the truth is that it doesn't matter whether that specific machine still exists, because the system it represented continues. As long as there are desperate people and exploitative labor conditions, as long as survival requires the sacrifice of humanity, the machine's work will never truly be finished. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, We open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.